What is intergenerational trauma? Many times, when something heavy, something threatening happens to one of us, and that's not digested in our bodies and in our minds, the next generation gets this undigested stuff with the homework to digest it or to make sense of it. And without this type of work, the cycle of trauma or imprints is breathed into us and to those who will come after us. Today we'll talk about trauma. How do you know if you're just stressed or you have inherited wounds from those who came before you? We will have, I promise you, more trauma episodes, but this is a great episode to start from. And we'll start basically from understanding just the difference with trauma, inherited trauma, and if you're simply stressed or depressed. So stay tuned. Are Filipinos truly bilingual? We use the same language at home but speak in love languages foreign to each other, together but separated. Kamusta? I'm Rowan, licensed psychotherapist mom, immigrant twice, first generation Pinoy raising my mixed Filipino-American children in America. I found that after visiting 500 Filipino homes, I continue to be a student of the culture. In this podcast, we would be seatmates in this beautiful cultural classroom. And by the way, did I tell you I need my kaping barako straight from Batangas before each class? If you're interested in learning the deep intricacies of the Filipino culture, especially as it merged with American culture, talks about trauma-informed care and deepening your Filipino relationships across generations, which includes my fave topic, Pinoy love languages, you're in the right place. Before we begin, I want to let you know that you can submit a question to this Filipino therapist by leaving a voicemail or writing me at info@calamancyjuice.com. Don't worry, all the info is in the show notes. And if I pick your question, it's possible I can create an episode around it. Okay ba? If you think someone else would benefit from listening to this podcast or specifically this episode, please share. Sharing is caring. Information is meant to be shared in communal spaces, especially those that are meant to connect and to encourage healing.
So let's begin by talking about psychological primal needs. These are you sleeping well? Are you eating well? For some people, they need to be connected to some type of spirituality, whether it's worshiping nature, worshiping God. Do you have personal space, a time to be alone? Also, time to be connected with others, and many other psychological primal needs. You must rule out first. If you're feeling down and you're thinking, am I stressed or depressed? You want to rule out first if there are any other explanation to your symptoms. So if you have bouts of crying, feeling like you have loss of pleasure, don't worry if you cannot figure this out. This is the reason we have doctors and therapists. You can just begin by being curious, even writing down your symptoms. It's the same physically, right? When we see the doctor because we have recurring stomach aches, the doctor asks us, okay, do your labs so that you and the doctor could make a link. Are your sugar levels too high? Do you have a thyroid problem? Now, the caveat here is that it is hard to figure out which came first. Are you having a hard time sleeping because of your worries, fears, and something of an immediate trauma, like a car accident just occurred? Or is it vice versa? Are you feeling like fearful because you're not meeting the psychological primal need to sleep? Also, ask yourself, when did this all began? And did something else happen during this time? So if you notice suddenly you get easily startled, think back, like, when did this start? And write notes or just note it in your head, right? That's important. Did something happen? So if you're looking back in retrospect, oh, that happened in February, is there something that happened that was different? Now, I want to highlight the word different because sometimes it's not just about something bad that happens. Stress, especially, can come even with events that seemingly are happy events for most people. For instance, the coming of a new baby, wedding, right? Those things can actually cause people stress. So be curious. You probably hear me say this often in this podcast, is to be curious. Another one is if you have unexplained physical ailments where the doctor keeps telling you, okay, you're fine, blood work is normal, such and such is within normal limits. And it could be fibromyalgia or restless leg syndrome, etc., whatever that may be. Now, I want to point out that I'm not concluding that these diagnoses are from intergenerational trauma or that they're not real. Of course, the feeling that we feel from those diagnoses, they're real. But what we're trying to figure out is where did they come from? Okay, to just be curious and be aware. So that's one thing, unexplained physical ailments. Now, another one is this feeling of blah. People come to me like in the consult and they're like, I just can't connect with people. I just feel like I am just like a hamster in a wheel, right? It's like I do one thing and there's just no, they don't even use the word zest. It's just like there's no life. Like I'm living, but I'm not fully living, basically. And so it's like I'm a robot and I can't seem to figure this out and they're doing the best that they can. One example I want to give you, moving on and just leaving the blah feeling, is that when it comes to intergenerational trauma, so this person has always complained about not feeling like she belonged, like she never belonged. Even if she has friends, a good set of coworkers, like that's her core language, is like she doesn't belong. And in following her story and the story generations prior, we were able to excavate that her father was poor, discriminated, and then the great grandfather was apparently disowned by his Chinese mom who wanted him to marry a Chinese woman. And so, just that realization is key to healing. It's almost like you were handcuffed and you found the exact key to uncuff you. Now, of course, if you're a trauma informed therapist or you're seeing one, the work does not end there. But that's pivotal. There's a lot of things that you can do to actually make some meaning to that experience. And like in the beginning, I mentioned digest. If we have intergenerational trauma, it's undigested. So if you have a vision of like when you eat something bad, like, I don't know, some type of meat, I'm of course not against meat eaters, that's fine. But sometimes they just stay in your gut and it's like it bothers you. So in a way, that's a vision of intergenerational trauma. Naturally, that passes us. It's like we are able to excrete it. And if we don't, it stays with us. And that's what happens to the next generation when it's not metabolized. So, your job today is to actually digest that, to metabolize that so you don't pass it to the next generation. So, again, let me just recap this real quick. So, be curious, is there any other explanation to symptoms or feelings that you're going through? And then So ask yourself and rule out. Do what you can if you need to see your doctor. And also begin to be curious, when did this start? Ask yourself that question. Also, if you have this blah feeling, be curious, right? Like, I'm just not able to connect with another person. Now let's move to another point. There's this depression, and depression, clinical depression, has criteria. Okay, like in 2 weeks, loss of pleasure, bouts of crying. Now, in Asian culture, it's found that it's dysthymia, which is another diagnosis. You don't have to worry about the diagnosis. The only reason that I'm sharing it with you is because there's a label to it. Now, I'm the type of therapist that I don't care much about diagnosing, but I also understand it's helpful. Because imagine if someone is like having this pervasive recurring stomach ache and someone said, "Oh, you have a stomach so and so diagnosis." You're like, there's a term for it. I'm not crazy, right? So it helps really. So I'm not opposed to a diagnosis. It's something that is not in the forefront of my practice as a clinician. Going back to this time, Asians have this because it's not this depression that's glaring, like, oh, I'm really sad, 2 weeks, having these symptoms. It's basically within 2 years at least where you like feel like you're floating. Like I mentioned, you just feel blah. And so it makes sense, at least to me, why we see it more in Asians because we're not taught to openly express our emotions. So I share that because not that I just immediately link dysthymia or this blah feeling with intergenerational trauma, but something to be curious about. And if you don't know what to do, you consult with your doctor and or find a therapist that is a good match for you. In our next episodes, at least one of the episode in this podcast, I'll help you figure that out. Of course, I'm a therapist. It doesn't have to be me, but my goal is that you see someone that can support you.
By the way, this episode is brought to you by Story Therapy. If you're living someone else's story or you're not liking where the story of your life is going, Story Therapy can help. This is a framework I created using the neuroscience of updating your old stories by combining mind and body work. It's a framework, not a program, because it's my belief as a practitioner that I need to tailor my system to you and not the other way around. You don't have to fit yourself to my program. Check the link or the episode notes for a complimentary consult if you're interested in finding your story. So let's hug all this information together. So stress happens when maybe you have not met all of your primal needs or something occurred in the immediate recent, something recently happened, which is a link to your stress. So that's stress, something that occurred, there's an event, and you can link that to why there's a change in your mood or your feelings inside. Now, depression is different. I mean, you can be going through intergenerational trauma and have depression. This is possible, but it's also possible that you're depressed and it's for something else, right? Stress, when also not treated, many stress can go away on its own, but if not treated for some, it can go into depression. That's also possible. Now, trauma again is defined. This is not intergenerational trauma, just trauma is defined where, an event occurred, right? And that event put you in a very helpless place where, all the coping mechanisms that you have are just it's just too overwhelming, the event, and you're not able to utilize any of those coping mechanisms. So that's trauma. And I define intergenerational trauma as like trauma that have occurred in the prior generation and passed on to you. That's that stuff that's undigested. And it's your position now, it's your role to digest it so that you can serve the next generation, the ones that are coming after you, your children. Now, intergenerational trauma, it could be that something just happened. It could be that it's abrupt. Suddenly, you woke up one day and you're fearful of crossing the bridge. Be curious if you could not find the link. What happened in the immediate or something that just happened in the past? But it doesn't always have to be abrupt. It could be that you just feel disconnected. One thing that you want to also watch out for is this intergenerational family feud. It's like moms and children are always fighting, and then the next generation is the same thing over and over and over again. When that happens, even I, as a psychotherapist, I'm really curious, is there intergenerational trauma here? So it's important, friends, that you find a practitioner that's trauma informed, best if they're licensed. But the most important part is that you feel good with them. Most clinicians, therapists give a complimentary session. That's the time you can ask questions and really get a feel of the therapist. The most important part in that therapeutic relationship is your relationship with them. So I like to say it's like dating. And the reason why I say that, because I don't want people to get frustrated with therapy just because they saw one therapist or two therapists. It's not them. And that's the thing. Sometimes they feel it's them. And that's painful for me as a therapist. I think that to be responsible therapists, if we don't have this specialization to treat our clients, that we shouldn't take on that client. Or we can always say, because we're only humans, and in reality therapists are want the best also for their clients. They want to help. And so know that you are the consumer. You can change therapists. Keep trying. It's like dating, like I said. And it's not you. I don't want you to think it's therapy. It's just that it's not the best match therapist. So, again, there is a corresponding blog post to this episode. Please check the show notes. Also, some recommended books are in the episode notes and the story therapy link if you're interested in a complimentary session. It's been great. Thank you again for lending me your ear. This has been fun. I love talking about everything about trauma. Again, you can leave a voicemail. Also, if this helps you, help this podcast find more people by leaving a stellar review. Again, this is Rowan. Sa uulitin. Until then, bye!